Special thanks to the K Family Foundation, lead underwriters for MOSAIC. Hello, my name is Barbara Kay, and on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, I'd like to welcome you to our program, MOSAIC. Our special guest on MOSAIC today is the New York Times Jerusalem Bureau Chief, Ethan Bronner. We'll be back with our guest and our program right after this brief message.
Thanks to your support, Federation maintains the fabric of the Jewish community. By enabling our community to remain vital and vibrant today and for future generations.
Mentoring more than 400 at-risk children through the Youth Futures program in Federation's partnered communities of Israel's Sachar region.
Providing a wealth of social, welfare, spiritual and educational services available to the 110,000 members of the Jewish community in St. Petersburg, Russia.
We touch so many and do so much. Your dollars fund the work of our Federation. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to MOSAIC, and welcome to you, Ethan. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
I'm very happy to be here, Barbara. Thank you.
You're here for a very special occasion. It's the Eva and Danny Abraham Project, and you're the guest speaker for tomorrow's venue. We have the pleasure of interviewing you before. You've been in Jerusalem for a long time. You've been the bureau chief since 2008 for the New York Times. But this is your third run in Jerusalem.
Correct.
So you are an expert in the Middle East. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about the difficulty of covering the Middle East in general. How much difficulty do you have getting information? What is the process you go through, etc.?
Well, thanks, and it's great to be here. Of course, my job now for the New York Times is just Israel and the Palestinians. It's not the entire Middle East. I do help because of the Arab Spring of the last 8 months. I have gone out to Jordan and Egypt and Bahrain and so on and helped the Arab world correspondents because it was such an overwhelming story. But broadly, what I do every day is Israel and the Palestinians. So it's not hard to get information there. And in fact,
it's not hard in Israel, you mean?
It's not hard in Israel.
No.
And among the Palestinians, it's also, there is an actual information policy which has grown quite a lot in the last 10 years. There are press officers, there are efforts to hold briefings and so on. Obviously, Israel is a society with much more investigation, more data produced, more an attempt to examine itself in public, and therefore for me as an outsider who is trying to sort of scoop up the conversation, it's a very easy place to work. And Palestine is less easy, but compared to much of the Arab world, Palestinians do a decent job as well.
That's
Sure.
interesting, because one of the things I said when you spoke at Brandeis, I think it was last year, 2010, you said something to the effect that in Israel it's easy. All you need is a radio.
That's true.
Because they have
it's a lot easier. You are right to say that.
You can lie in bed
Right.
and write a column.
Right. What I said is that from 6 a.m. until noon, if you listen either to Kol Yisrael or the Army radio, Galei Tzahal, all day long, for all morning long, there are these talk shows where they examine and interview heads of various ministries and so on, and you could easily get the conversation just from sitting in bed. It's true.
Right,
and
so,
that's not true in Palestine.
Well, why does Israel seem to get such bad press? Nationally, I'm talking about.
I understand. I mean, you know, because the notion in there is that I also am giving it bad press. I sort of reject the idea that there is bad press for Israel. What I would answer is that journalism is about trouble. It's about tensions. It's about difficulties. And that if you were to look at what the New York Times writes about France or Russia or New York, you'd also classify it as bad news, okay? So that it's not anti-Israel, it's what journalism is about. It's about problems. And that's why we're there, to chronicle the conflict.
Yeah, but okay, let me ask you this one question that always bothers me. As a journalist, are you forced to write, or do you intellectually write to please the philosophy of the newspaper, or are you there to just give your opinion?
I'm not, I would say neither.
Neither?
Okay, I'm not there to give my opinion. I'm there to offer my ability to observe, report, and analyze, but no opinion at all. I'm not there for my opinion. And the paper also has no opinion about Israel. The editorial page has its policies and its editorials, but that's about 5% of the paper. The rest of the paper has no official view. The only thing that the New York Times stands for as a news organization is sort of a range of values, if you like. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, equality for women. I mean, there are certain values, and I would say that in this conflict, the New York Times doesn't question the legitimacy of the State of Israel. I think there are news organizations abroad that do. I don't think the New York Times does. In its core, those aren't the core questions that it raises. It raises questions about its policies.
Okay, you know, all right. Then why, for instance, don't you see anything in the newspaper about the fact that the rockets are still shooting from Gaza into Israel?
Well, you do. I mean,
but not to the extent. I mean, they don't make a deal out of it. It's a horrible thing that's taking place.
well, I mean, today and yesterday, there are articles about it because there were a number of rockets that came, and there were Israeli incursions as well into Gaza. So today, the day we're speaking, and yesterday, both days had newspaper articles about that in the New York Times. The question is, how often can you write about it, depending on how intense it is? And since the Gaza war of 08-09, the intensity went way down. So, and most of those rockets fall in open fields. So the question is, what do you do about that? Now, certainly when I go to Gaza, I write about the phenomenon. But until someone is hurt or killed, it doesn't go above the bar of actual news.
I see. You know, you said something that the Palestinians have a very simple narrative. The Israelis is much more complex.
That's
Would
right.
you share that?
Sure. I mean, I think that the Zionist narrative is a subtle and complicated narrative for an outsider to grasp. The idea that this is a piece of land where a long time ago, a group of people who, it isn't always clear to everybody, is a nation. They think of them as members of a religion. So are they a nation? And if they are, what does it mean that 2,000 or 3,000 years ago they lived there? And what right does that give them to reclaim it? I think that's a complicated narrative for people to understand. Whereas people who've lived in a certain place for some dozens, in some case hundreds of years, to be sort of in suddenly conflict with the returnees, and they are poorer and generally less advanced than the ones who've come, that's a much easier narrative to understand, I think, for people. And therefore, there's a natural tendency, I think, to have a sense that with the underdog.
Yeah, I guess you're right, but somehow or other, Israel's narrative never comes over as a truth and the way to go. I mean, the press is merciless, I think. I'm not talking only about the New
No,
York
no,
Times.
it's okay. I'm not here as a spokesman of the press.
No.
I can only defend my own work.
Okay, which you don't have to defend. I've read every one of your articles and they're terrific.
Thank you.
I mean, you're a great journalist. As a matter of fact, you won, as an aside, you won an award for the articles that you wrote about, September 11th.
Those were articles that I helped edit, and that was actually, the award went to the writers, just so you know. It was a reflected glory for me.
Well, but it was a sensational opportunity for showcasing your ability, so don't say that.
Thank you.
At any rate, I feel bad because I think that you get a distorted view of what Israel is all about, even from some Israelis. I mean, I heard Amos Oz speak on PR today, and I was shocked as an Israeli how negatively he spoke about what we're doing with the Palestinians, etc. Do you feel that way?
You know, because my job is to not actually to give my opinion, I'm not going to express a view on whether I do or don't think Oz is overstating things. My job is really to observe and to report and to analyze, but not to say it's good or bad. Leave that to you. You know, I think that the way that the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis is a central core issue for Israel, and it makes sense that Oz, who's on the left, is very upset about it, and that those who are on the right say it's not so bad. That's the dispute that I'm helping to report.
Yeah. You also wrote an interesting article on the tent city and the fact that the peaceful protest of the Israelis was, first of all, it was peaceful, which was wonderful, but it also suggested a deeper need that wasn't being addressed. Can you share what you felt about that?
Sure. I mean, what struck me very much about that, and I can relate it to the exchange with Gilad Shalit, with the young man who was held in Gaza for more than 5 years, is I felt like both the pro-Gilad Shalit move and the social protest movements had to do with a yearning in Israel for a return to a greater sense of collectivism, which has been lost in the last 20 years as Israel has become more like America, more of an individualist society, much richer, at least for some people. There is an enormous amount of wealth today in Israel. And in the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s and first half of the 80s, it was not a country with a great deal of wealth. Everyone kind of lived in the same simple manner. And there was a sense that your relationship with the society and the government was clear. And I think that has fallen away, and that those social protest movements were saying that something has happened where there's a thin layer of rich, powerful people who are running us. I'm not telling you that's true, but that was the sentiment, and a desire to change that, to go back to what was.
It's interesting. I think the release of Shalit created amongst many of the Israelis a sense of a revitalization of the government fulfilling the needs of the people. On the other hand, there was also the conflict.
Of course.
And it was a moral judgment that had to be made.
More than moral. I think the issue is it's a strategic judgment that has to be made. And the interesting question, I wrote also a story that talked about this, which is that sense of family that Israelis have about one another, at least Israeli Jews have about one another, that led to such a strong move to get Gilad Shalit out, is an incredible strength of the society, but it is also a weakness of the society, because the idea that you should make all public policy judgments based on what it would mean for your family, as if your family is represented, is not necessarily the wisest way to go. In other words, if, for example, I don't know if you remember, but when Michael Dukakis was running for president in the late 1980s, there was a debate in which he was opposed to a capital punishment. And so the questioner, I can't remember whether it was his opponent or the journalist, said to him, well, what if your wife were raped and killed? Would you still be against the death penalty?
So what did he say?
He actually fumbled and didn't know how to answer, okay?
But he didn't answer
the
it.
proper answer is that is not the basis for public policy. Okay, if somebody killed my wife, I'd want to strangle him, he should say. But that's not how you make public policy. And I think the interesting question about the Shalit question is, although everybody felt as if it was his child, is that the question you want to ask when looking at a larger issue like, should 1,000 people be released from prison? I don't think it's clear that that's the right way to go.
On that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with the remainder of the program right after this brief message.
The Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County makes so much possible every day.
Serving tens of thousands of kosher meals to seniors and families through food pantries, the Jewish Hunger Response, holiday meals, and on-site meal programs.
Operating the Jewish Community Assistance Network in 6 local communities to provide health, wellness, and social programs to more than 2,000 seniors.
But we need your help. Volunteer your time. Pledge your support. Make a difference. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to Mosaic, and prior to the break we were talking about the release of Shalit and the fact that there was this protest because this was a need the Israeli people felt to become like a peoplehood, in a sense a collective concerned body, and but they did get 25 cents off the cottage cheese, I think, a reduction. Seriously, you know, it's interesting. When you think about Israel, its economic standing in that area is fantastic. I mean, they have, I think their GNP is terrific. They have a very low unemployment rate. You wonder why there should be such an unrest, a sense of unrest. And I think what you said probably is the reason.
I don't actually, you're right, and in fact, that's right. The thing is that the unrest is not overwhelming. It was important over the summer. It's kind of behind us now. Israel is not particularly in the middle of turmoil. It's a pretty stable political situation internally. The government is stable. Prime Minister Netanyahu remains quite popular. I think he's the most popular politician in Israel. And I think you could argue that it's an unusually stable moment in Israeli politics.
Yeah. I know the Israelis want peace desperately. Do you think there's a possibility?
I think there's no possibility. I don't mean to be too depressing, but I see no chance that the Israelis and the Palestinians will come to a deal in the next year or so. I see nothing but misunderstanding and disagreement and a failure on either side to get the other side's concerns.
Yeah. Well, do you think the United States can do something about it, or should?
I think that the United States should do something about it. Again, I'm not in the should business, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable proposition that the United States should be more active. But I think the chance of the Obama administration or any administration actually spending the political capital domestically in this country that it needs in order to make that happen is basically zero as well, because there are too many other more important problems on the agenda for this government right now, this administration, and including foreign policy questions, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, not to mention the economy.
And Turkey.
Oh, sure. But Turkey, again, if you want to look at it, I mean, I think that the problem, if you like, for the Israel-Palestine question for this government is that it lacks a kind of urgency. People are not killing each other. It's just not a happy situation. But it is not, there isn't an urgency on either side to change.
Yeah, but I tell you something, Israel sometimes feels it's all alone. Do you agree?
Well, it turns out it's not all alone. It's got a very strong relationship with the United States and with much of the world. But I do agree that the longer there is no agreement about what to do about the Palestinian question, and at the same time there is no real threat of terrorism in Israel, and there is basically, it has largely disappeared in the last 3 or 4 years. Disappeared is a bit strong, but greatly reduced. that then the sense of other countries' concern for Israel declines because it doesn't see it facing a kind of daily danger, and the world does not understand why Israel remains in the West Bank and not being more active about helping the Palestinians form a state.
You know something, there is so much confusion and there's so much disagreement. In order for there, and it to be, you're absolutely right, in order for there to be peace, people have to understand each other. I don't think either side understands
I completely agree with you.
each other.
And the thing that's shocking for me, as you said, I've been covering this place for 30 years on and off, is that I think the understanding is declining, not increasing.
Yeah, well, look what's happening with Turkey and with the new prime minister who's going farther away from the West. And even in this tragedy that took place in Turkey, and Israel was the first responder, and they refused them
At first.
And when they were desperate, they knew they needed them, so they opened their arms and said, sure, come and help us. And it's frightening, you know, the United Nations is frightening. The situation with the Palestinians with UNESCO, that doesn't disturb you?
You know, again, I'm not in the disturbance business. I'm the observation business. I can't. It's not a question of whether it disturbs me. What is clear is that as a result of UNESCO voting the Palestinians in, there's $60 or $70 million of the United States contribution, which will go away. And
yes.
it will also further drive, I think, the Israelis and the Palestinians away from talking to one another. So, you know, you could, but I mean, the Palestinian argument has been, these talks have gotten us nowhere over nearly 20 years. We're trying something new, which is to take the world and try to get it to pressure Israel to deal with us in the way that we think is appropriate.
Yeah. What are you going to speak to the people tomorrow about?
I'm going to talk about the challenges of what I do in Israel-Palestine, some of the things we talked about in the beginning, the difficulties of reporting this in a way that either side can hear or outsiders can understand. And I'm going to talk about how Israel-Palestine question inside of the turmoil of the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, whatever you want to call them, how that's affecting the conflict and American policy and Israel.
Okay. I think that should be a fascinating thing. I'm going to be there.
Okay.
Before the program, I was talking to you about the fact that I read your book, Battle for Justice, which really has nothing to do with the
my former
Middle
life.
East, right? But it's a fascinating story about how the Supreme Court elects and nominates Supreme Court justices and what happens to them, and how the Senate really is in charge of the debate and how they approve it. Now, you wrote this was an acrimonious debate with Bork. President Reagan, who was a very, very popular president and thought he could get anything done that he wanted, and he did a lot. He nominated, when Powell, the Chief Justice Powell retired, he nominated Bork.
Right.
And what took place?
Well, it was quite a battle. It was 1987, so it's 25 years ago, whatever it is, 24 years ago. And ultimately, the Senate rejected Robert Bork, the nomination of Robert Bork. And the argument of this book is it was a confluence of a range of factors. Bork was very conservative on a number of factors. And actually, while it's true that Reagan was an extremely popular president, this was in the 7th year of his administration, and he was having issues. Iran-Contra had just broken. And he was, in fact, I think the Democrats sensed a moment to push back. In addition to the issues of abortion and civil rights, affirmative action and so on, and freedom of speech, where Bork had been quite controversial, fairly hard on the right in various parts of his life, and they put down a marker and said, this is outside of the mainstream legal debate in this country, which it was at the time and may not be today, by the way.
Do you want to know something? As a, I mean, I read a great deal, and I've met a lot of very interesting people having done this program for a long time. But I really knew nothing about, I was naive about how impactful the Supreme Court justices are, how some relate to the Constitution, how it's supposed to be adhered to verbatim, or does it adjust to the change in the society after so many years? It's fascinating. This book is an excellent book. I'd recommend it to anybody that's watching.
Thank you very much.
Tell me, what made you write this book?
Well, I covered that fight over the nomination for the Boston Globe at the
Oh,
time.
you did?
I was the
Okay.
Supreme Court correspondent and legal affairs correspondent for the Globe. And in fact, when it was over, an editor walked by my desk and said, "I hope you're keeping your notes for the book." And I had no idea what he was talking about. And then he said, "It's really an amazing story and deserves a book. Why don't you do it?" And I took a year off and did it. So that's why I did it. And it was a fascinating moment. And by the way, the court has moved much closer to where Robert Bork is today than it was at the time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Share that with our viewers. Explain that.
Well, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Samuelito and of course Clarence Thomas, who came after this, all of them basically share Robert Bork's notion of originalism, this idea of trying to interpret the Constitution through the original intent of those who wrote the Constitution, rather than as a living, breathing document concept, which is more of a liberal view of the Constitution. So I think he'd be actually fairly at home in the majority today on the court.
Yeah. You know, it was interesting that I was looking at the back too. You share, you interviewed Bork, and his wife, and apparently, how did he feel about you doing this book?
Well, it's interesting. He, in fact, didn't grant me a direct interview. It was by writing.
Oh.
He was writing his own book, and he wrote his own book at the time. So he wasn't particularly eager to encourage me in my book. But to be fair, he was not hostile, and he didn't urge those around him not to talk to me, which he could have done. So, you know, he wrote his own book, which was, by the way, a much bigger seller than this book at the time, because, I mean, he was the guy, and people were he had a strong, almost cult-like following, in which he wrote, largely it was a book about his philosophy of the law and his own career, and something about what it was like for him to go through this process. So he found it, of course, very difficult and unpleasant. He felt that he was slandered and mistreated by the Senate.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I know. I have to tell you, you have Joe Biden. What did he have to say about it? He liked it. He liked what you wrote about him?
You know, I'm not sure we spoke afterwards. It's true that it's not a completely flattering profile of Joe Biden.
No, I was going to say that. Kennedy?
Kennedy, this is an interesting thing because it also is not especially flattering. I think it shows a kind of a bare knuckles policy that he had toward this nomination, and generally, Kennedy liked it. Kennedy was happy to be presented as a tough politician, and he was quite friendly to me afterwards.
Was he?
Yes.
Well, I tell you something, the response to the book has to be great. I mean, it's a great read, and I recommend it, and it's really a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I enjoyed being here.
Yeah, and despite the fact that you didn't give me a positive feeling about peace, it was a pleasure to have you anyway.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being with us as well. Be with us again next week when we have another look into the Jewish world. Goodbye from MOSAIC.